Standard 3. So Standard 3 deals with duty to clients and prospective clients. And if you'll recall in our little preamble when we started talking about the ethics material in general, what I said was not all the standards were created equal, and in fact one of those was probably more important and more testable than the others, and of course this is the one that I think is at the top of the heap. What the ethics material is really designed to encourage is ethical treatment of clients in the investment world. So we certainly want to protect the reputation of the discipline. We want to protect the reputation of the designation and the integrity of the capital markets. But all of that is more or less tertiary to the idea, or supporting of the idea, really, of protecting the clients and prospective clients. So this is a big, fat, hairy deal, as the saying goes. So anyway, let's move on. What you're going to see is that this is a fairly long standard, has a number of parts. It seems to be in some places a little overlapping with the other material, but that's because the other material in the code and standards in general is intended to support this central idea of making sure that clients aren't harmed by our behavior. Okay? All right, so looking first at Part A, so loyalty, prudence, and care. Now, recall that when not when we started, but back as we got into the material, I told you that I thought there were some concepts around which the curriculum was built, or the ethics curriculum was built. One of those was independence, the second one was reasonable basis, and then suitability. Well, what about this loyalty idea? And I guess in my mind, loyalty is meshed with independence. So certainly they are different. They're related but separable concepts. So independence is the idea that we can make clear decisions because we haven't allowed our decision-making process to be tainted by outside influences. Once we are in a position to make independent decisions, then we have to make sure that we are being loyal to our clients. That is, we are pursuing the path that would be best for them. So really what I should have said, rather than independence, reasonable basis or due diligence, and then suitability, with the caveat of disclosure to follow on, recall. What I should have said was independence / loyalty, then reasonable basis, then suitability, and then disclosure as the cure for any problems that we see in these other parts. So Part A, loyalty, prudence, and care. So we have a duty of loyalty to our clients to act with reasonable care and exercise prudent and independent judgment, to act on behalf of the clients and place their interest before the employer's or our own interests. So there's a hierarchy that we'll see emerge here, and that hierarchy is essentially going to be clients, then employers, and then us. And while it's not directly stated in the curriculum itself, you kind of have to read between the lines. What we're really going to see is that it's clients, capital markets, employer, and then we are at the bottom of the food chain there in terms of what order our interests come in. Okay, the point here is that we have to determine and comply with any applicable fiduciary duty. And while this is the third bullet point, this is a big deal. So what is a fiduciary duty? Well, it doesn't, the curriculum doesn't define fiduciary duty particularly well in my estimation. But the point here is this: if you were going to buy a car from me, then I would have a used car, then I would have a duty of loyalty to you as another consumer to divulge any known defects. So if you came up to me and said, well, are you holding it together with oatmeal and baling wire? And I in fact was, well, I would have to be honest in my dealings with you, all that sort of thing. So that's just a normal transaction, a buyer and a seller. The point here is that a fiduciary duty requires a higher standard, okay? And that means that in essence, I am buying a car for you. So a fiduciary duty, I am spending your money, I'm making decisions as your proxy, and that implies a much higher standard of loyalty. And that is probably the best way to view much of the ethics material. So we talked about the idea of you have a money manager working for an unsophisticated client. Okay, well, there's a fiduciary duty there. So I am the money manager. I have this unsophisticated client. I am not only supposed to act in a way that is within the confines of the law, I'm not doing anything illegal, all that sort of stuff. I'm supposed to identify and comply with my fiduciary duty, which means that I'm going to act for the benefit of my client, and I'm going to put their interest above my own. So the notion of fiduciary duty is actually a pretty big deal. So let's talk about guidance on this. So looking here, we see that when we're taking investment actions, the client's interest comes first. You will not find an exception to this in the curriculum. The client's interest always comes first. Exercise prudence, care, skill, and diligence that a person familiar with such matters would use. Well, this language is actually something that is closely related to something called the prudent investor rule. So when you get to level 2, which I'm not trying to get you there today, but just as a quick insight as to what we're talking about here, we used to have what was called the prudent man rules. And the prudent man rules essentially invoked one type of behavior if you're working under a fiduciary duty. We have migrated in most industrialized countries to what would be a prudent investor rule or something beyond that, which says in order to make decisions, you have to have knowledge. So it implies knowledge. We'll see that it also invokes the notion that we are going to have some portfolio theory involved in our decision-making process. So we have to have prudence, care, skill, and diligence. Not just, we can't just be prudent, careful, and skillful and just be some sort of Yahoo. We also have to be someone who's trained, someone who's thought about and educated in these manners, because we're supposed to be a person familiar with such matters. Okay, of course, we're going to follow our applicable fiduciary duty, and remember that the client may be the investing public. If we're talking about, making research recommendations and distributing those research reports, well, we may be distributing those to anyone who will listen. In that case, our client is the investing public, and we're going to have to make sure that we are acting in their best interest. That is, we are giving the very best that we can for the client, and we are not withholding anything. And as a caveat to all of this, if you ever are in a position, if you're ever in a position on the exam where you're reading something, some sort of vignette or question statement, and there is a player in the question who is who's not saying anything wrong, but is being very careful in how they structure trades and what they say and how they talk to people around them, so that the intent is to not have full disclosure or not to have full transparency. Okay, well, that means that there is a problem. They are somewhere along the line violating this duty. If in no other way, they're violating their duty to the investing public. So if there's something that they should be disclosing, something they know, something that the typical investor would want to know, and they are sort of dancing around the issue, well, then that is not going to be something, that's not going to be someone who is behaving ethically according to these standards. Continuing with the guidance. Okay, we're going to manage pools of client assets in accordance to the terms of the governing documents. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say about governing documents here in the ethics material at level 1. We'll see a little bit of enhancement of that at level 2. But level 3, man, you're going to get blown out of the water with governing document stuff. So there's just a lot of information at level 3 on governing documents. We'll see this referred to in a little while as an IPS, an investment policy statement, and it's coming. You'll see it when we get there if you're not familiar with it now. So make investment decisions in the context of a total portfolio. Now, this relates back to that prudent man, prudent investor rule thing, which we really don't have to have a lot of knowledge of until we get to level 2, where there's a fair amount of information on that. But nonetheless, the notion here is that we are not responsible for the performance of an individual security, because we understand modern portfolio theory. So we can go and we have a portfolio that we're managing for, a widows and orphans fund is the sort of the euphemism that people use. Well, it might be that it's appropriate because of modern portfolio theory and low correlations and those types of things to take 2% of that and allocate it to some wigged out limited partnership hedge fund thing, whatever it happens to be. So decisions aren't made on the basis of the security. They're made on the basis of the portfolio, and we still, beyond that, have to consider the suitability in a portfolio context for our client, and we'll see that coming up later. Okay, what about voting proxies? So I remember, not the question itself, but a scenario when I was taking the exam, and there was this money manager, and this was back when we had open-ended exams. That's how old I am. And they said, well, we manage funds to the best interest of our clients, and we don't take a position on proxy votes. Well, that's a direct violation of the Code of Ethics, right? So if you are managing money for a client, so you have a discretionary account, okay, well, you receive proxies. You are responsible for evaluating the issue that has come to the fore with respect to this proxy vote, and then responsibly voting that in your client's interest. Okay, soft dollars. This is something else that if you work a lot in the investment industry, you've probably heard about this already. You're certainly going to get a lot of it at level 2 again, but we really only have it mentioned here a couple of times at level 1. But a soft dollar, just so you'll know, and because you are responsible for it here within the curriculum, soft dollars must be used for the benefit of the client. Now, what's a soft dollar? So I have a portfolio that I'm managing for my unsophisticated client. Normal scenario. Okay? As part of managing that portfolio, I have to initiate trades. In order to initiate trades, I hire a broker. Well, when the broker executes a trade for me, I of course pay them. How do I pay them? I pay them with the client's money. Okay, so that brokerage, that money that I give to the broker is client money. Well, on occasion, the broker will give me something back. Maybe that's some research or something else. So I don't know what it would be. But anything else we receive back, well, I do know what it would be, but it doesn't matter. Anything that we would receive back from the broker in exchange for directing trades to that particular brokerage is called soft dollars. Okay, now how did we get that? So we're getting something from the broker who executed the trade, and what they of course want, their motivation is to keep us sending trades their way. We're paying for that with client dollars. So the client dollars are used to get the trade, they get the trade, and something else comes back. That something else is called soft dollars. Well, who does that belong to? You're paying for it with client's money, so the soft dollars belong to the client and must be used for the benefit of the client is the point. So soft dollars have to be used for the benefit of the client. That's actually one of the, there's a fairly significant reading in the stub material at level 2 where we get to expand on that considerably. So you'll see some more of that as we go through. Okay, what about recommended procedures? Okay, looking at recommended procedures here, we're going to follow all rules and laws, of course. If we're duty to clients will not involve us breaking laws. Okay, establish client investment objectives, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Okay, we have a responsibility to diversify, dealing fairly with clients in all of our investment actions. We're going to talk about this and some specifics in just a few minutes, just a couple of slides. Disclose all possible conflicts. Okay, so remember I said there's these sort of 3 main things. So it's independence, loyalty, okay, it's reasonable basis due diligence, and then suitability. Well, what if there's a problem somewhere along the line there? So if there's a problem with your independence, you have some securities in your client's portfolio, but you also sit on an advisory board or something. Well, the cure for many of the problems would be to make sure that we have fair and complete disclosure, and we will see much more on this before we're done with the ethics material. So, and then of course vote the proxies. Well, we already said you can't come up with some policy that says, oh, we don't vote proxies because we just run the money. Okay, well, that's like coming up with a policy that says, oh, we don't look out for the client's best interest. Okay, you can't do that. So you got to make sure you're voting the proxies. Continuing with the recommended procedures. And so we're going to keep client information confidential. This will be a lot more to say on that in just a moment. Seek best trade and execution for clients. So when we are looking for a brokerage, we have to consider where are we getting the best service, and we've got to make sure that we're making that decision not based on who gives us the most free lunches, okay, but actually what is best for the client. And as always, okay, put the client's interest first. And if you are independent and loyal, okay, and then you are very likely to be in adherence to this particular part of putting the client's interest first. All right. Okay, so that is standard 3A, the first part of this big standard 3 that I think is has so much of the testable material. Let's move on to part B, okay, which deals with fair dealing. So fair dealing simply says we have to deal fairly and objectively with all clients. Okay, and that can become a caveat, and if you're a practicing money manager, then you can start to see some problems with that immediately, very likely. So deal fairly and objectively with all clients when you are providing, okay, this investment analysis, when you're making recommendations, when you're taking action, okay, or when you're engaging in any of your professional activities. Okay, so it doesn't really matter what you're doing. This is basically a way of saying if you're engaging in professional activities, then you have to deal fairly and objectively with all of your clients. Now, what does that mean? How about some guidance on it? Okay, well, this means that we cannot discriminate against any client when disseminating investment recommendations, for instance, or taking investment action. Now, it is important to understand that this idea that fair does not mean equal. So we're not necessarily obligated to treat all clients exactly equally, but we do have to treat them all fairly. So what does that mean? For instance, you can have, a brokerage account that gets one level of service, and then you can also have the gold-plated service. Okay, well, that's okay as long as it's disclosed and you don't disadvantage any client in the process. So you say, well, here's the cost of the gold-plated service. Okay, we're not, doing anything to the detriment of disadvantaging any of the other clients. And if you want to pay for the gold-plated service, then you can have access to that also. So different service levels are okay, but we can't have a different service level that says, okay, we're going to give all the good securities to this group and all the leftovers for this group. All right, so fair doesn't mean equal. So we don't, we have, and in fact, what we're really doing here is striving for fairness. So when we talk about, disseminating investment recommendations, we're going to try to get those out simultaneously. And of course, in the electronic world we live in today, that's getting easier and easier to do. But nonetheless, we're going to strive for fairness. Fairness doesn't mean equal. We can have different service levels, but we can never disadvantage one group of clients. So keep that in mind. Some more guidance on this with respect to investment recommendations. All clients must have a fair chance to act on every recommendation. So what does that mean? Well, what that says is, we're meeting, we have 3 clients, one that we really like and 2 other smaller clients. The big one is the one that we get all of our, make most of our living from. So we call them on the phone. We're talking about this change in recommendation. We're telling them where it comes from. Okay, as we hang up the phone, we hit the email send. Okay, to the other 2, and then we immediately start trading for our big client and for ourselves. Okay, sort of a pseudo front-running type thing. Anyway, so what is that? Well, we haven't given we've disseminated the recommendations, but we haven't given these other clients a fair chance to digest the information. All right. Now, the second bullet point, what if a client calls you and says, I want to buy stock X? Well, you have recently issued a sell order or a sell recommendation on stock X, and they're unaware of it. Can you take the order? So you're saying, hey, you should be selling this stuff, and one of your clients calls and says, I want to buy it. Well, is there any problem with that? Well, no, but if they are unaware of the recommendation change, then you have to advise them, okay, well, we have a sell on this. We're happy to accept the order from you, but we want you to know that our research department has a sell on this rather than a buy. If they say, yeah, I know that, I think you guys are all idiots, well, you go ahead and execute the trade for them. So it's okay to execute trades against your own recommendations, but you have to make sure that the clients are aware of what your recommendations are. What about with respect to investment actions? Okay, treat all clients fairly. That's, of course, the bottom line in all of this. Consider investment objectives and circumstances. Okay, investment objectives is something that we're going to have to talk about in a little more sophisticated way in just a few minutes. But basically, when you see the word objectives and we're talking about investment clients or investment service clients, okay, then that really means two things. And objectives means that we have considered risk and return. So we have a risk and a return objective, so there's always going to be two parts to that. Disclose your written allocation procedures. So in the stereotypical case, so we're talking about how we allocate shares in a hot IPO. Okay, the ethics material does not tell us how to do that. It just tells us that whatever we do has to be fair, and we ought to have rather than an ad hoc process, one that we make up every time we get some shares in a hot IPO, we have to have some sort of allocation procedure in place that we can use in order to better our clients. So and we make that available to them if they want to see it, and it probably should be in writing. And we can't disadvantage any client when distributing hot issues. So, you know, the dilemma there is you have some clients that reward you based on performance, some that reward you based on assets under management. You get an allowance of some shares in a hot IPO. We all know about IPO underpricing. Well, what you would want to do, your personal proclivity would be to take those shares in the hot IPO. Well, your personal proclivity would be to put them in your own portfolio. But if you weren't going to do that, you would want to put them into the portfolio of the customer that rewards you based on performance, okay, and not into the one that rewards you based on assets under management. Okay, well, that would be disadvantaging one of your clients in the allocation of these hot shares. So you can't consider whether you like clients or how they compensate you or those types of things in your allocation process. We don't know what the allocation process is. They don't tell us in the ethics material, but they do tell us that it can't disadvantage any of the individual clients. Okay, so where are we at now? So we're still doing fair dealing, but we're moving on to recommended procedures. So here, what are the recommended procedures? Well, we're going to limit the number of people aware of upcoming changes. So we're changing from a buy to a hold. Okay, well, how many people know about that? Let's keep it to a minimum. That's going to solve some of the problem with leaks and front running, all that sort of stuff. How about shortening the time frame? So if we can, from the time the decision's made to the time the decision is disseminated, the shorter we can make that, the less the problems are going to be. We ought to have pre-dissemination guidelines. So what kind of trading activity can go on before the guideline change? Well, we need some sort of written policies. Of course, we're striving for simultaneous distribution or dissemination of these recommendation changes. Okay, we ought to maintain a list of clients and their holdings so we would know who was impacted by that. And then we ought to disclose our trade allocation procedures. We've already talked about that previously. So what if the question on the exam said something like this? Okay, so we have some player on the exam, they're doing something, and it is suggested that they maintain a list of their clients and their holdings for the purposes of adequate dissemination of recommendation changes, and the key player says, no, I don't want to maintain a list of clients and their holdings for the purposes of dissemination of recommendation changes. Have they violated the code and standards? Okay, well, you have to be very careful. I'm going to back up one slide. I don't like to do that. I know it kind of gets confusing. But here, when we're talking about guidance, we're talking about the standard itself. Here, we have moved into what is recommended. So we've been doing that as we go through. But remember, there's a difference between the standard and the recommendation. So the recommendations are good things. They're things that can help you comply with the standard, but something like having to maintain a list of clients and their holdings, now in the computer age, that's no big deal. But nonetheless, that is a recommendation and not straightforward, not a firm commandment, if you want to say it that way, under the standards of professional conduct. So keep in mind the difference between the standard itself and the guidance for the following the standard, and then the recommended procedures, because the questions do get to where they ask you about the differences. And like I said, this this material is tested in such a way that you really have to know it. All right. So continuing on with our recommendations for Standard 3B, okay, review accounts regularly to ensure fair client treatment. So make sure you ought to have somebody going back and making sure that we have, one, fair practices in place, and two, that they're being implemented. Okay, if the firm offers different levels of service, then we need to disclose that to all of our clients. Okay, and then deviations from strict pro rata allocations of an IPO may be okay. Okay, but we're talking about deviations here, not a complete abandonment of our normal allocation process. So if there's some sort of minimum block sizes or those types of things, you don't want to put 8 shares of some IPO into a $40 million portfolio. So there are some practical considerations that come in. This is actually part of the curriculum that changed under the guideline book that came out in 2010. And one of the things I've seen, as I told you, I've now lived through 3 or 4 different editions of the code and standards, as some recognition of the practical aspects of actually managing a portfolio. So here's another one of those, and I thought I was glad it showed up. All right. Okay, well that is 3B, so that brings us, of course, to 3C, which is suitability. So remember, that's one of my pillars. So we've got independence, loyalty, okay, we've got due diligence and research, and then we have suitability. So what is it that we're going to say here? When in an advisory relationship, or really when we're doing anything with the client, and actually this standard is the longest standard in the or subpart in the ethics material. It takes 3 slides to talk about what suitability is here. But anyway, so if you're in an advisory relationship, you make reasonable inquiry. Okay, reasonable inquiry, we've got to talk about that word, as to a client's investment experience, their risk-return objectives. Remember, objectives, that word implies that you have considered not only return but also risk, financial constraints prior to making any recommendation or taking any action, and we have to update that regularly. So what does that mean, update it regularly? Okay, well, what is reasonable inquiry and what is updating regularly are questions that you need to have answered before you feel like you understand this very important Standard 3C, and we're going to talk about those as we go through. But basically, I would tell you for what is reasonable, you need to have a very high standard. Okay, so there has to be serious and effective investigation of the client's circumstances. And then we have some good guidelines for you on what it means to update regularly. But the regular part is easy. What does it mean to really have effective update is something that you're going to have to be careful about. Continuing on with discussion of the standard itself, okay, we have to ensure that an investment is suitable to a client's situation and consistent with the written objectives. Okay, so the written objectives, and we're going to talk about that again in a moment in the form of an IPS, investment policy statement, before you do anything. Make recommendations, take action, that sort of stuff. So there is a fundamental and a technical standard expressed here. The fundamental standard is one of suitability. Oh, I have investigated this security. I think that it offers a good risk-return trade-off. It has good portfolio characteristics for this client. Then you also have to ask yourself, is it in compliance with the written objectives? Okay, so there's a fundamental standard, an economic standard. Well, from what I know about the security and my research on it and what I know about portfolio theory, yes, this is suitable, but it also has to be in compliance with the written objectives. Okay? And of course, suitability is always going to be addressed in a portfolio context. So the portfolio context essentially means that we are going to look at modern portfolio theory, MPT. So if you're truly new to the CFA world and to the investment world, well, modern portfolio theory basically here, as described in the ethics material and in the legal standards, at least in the United States, refers to Markowitz theory. So Markowitz theory or portfolio theory are sort of interchangeable names, and of course we are absolutely going to talk about what that is if you're not familiar with it already. I would imagine that you probably most people watching this video will know something about diversification and correlation, all that sort of stuff. But if you don't fret, because we're going to start at zero and build up more modern portfolio theory. But the point here is we can reduce risk through diversification if we have a portfolio approach to investing, and that's what is being mandated here. Okay, and the final slide for the standard itself, when responsible for managing a portfolio to a specific mandate or a strategy or a style, we can only take actions or make recommendations that are consistent with that particular mandate, style, whatever it happens to be. So if we are managing an equity value portfolio, okay, well, we can't go out and recommend, something that would be a good investment in a bond. So this is an equity portfolio. It's for value securities, ones that have been beaten up by the market. So we have to stay within those parameters. Even if we think, wow, isn't that a great bond investment? We want to include a bond that's outside of the stated objectives. Then we got to go back and we've got to change the objectives, and we got to present those to the client, and we got to give them time to react to it, and all those types of things. So there's a lot that can go on there. Let's talk about guidance for this rather lengthy standard. So when in an advisory relationship, gather information at the outset and prepare, and this is the first time we've seen these letters, IPS. Prepare an IPS. That stands for Investment Policy Statement. Now, if you're not familiar with the idea of an investment policy statement, we are going to talk about it here. We'll talk about it a little level 2, but there's a lot of it at level 3. I think there's a couple of study sessions worth of it at level 3, in fact. Okay, so we have to have this, and basically an IPS is a written document that governs the investment process, and it does a lot of things. It sets up who is responsible for gathering information, and some of the sort of perfunctory things about the portfolio and all that sort of stuff. We, for level 1 purposes, are only interested in 2 things out of the IPS. We're interested in the objectives, which means risk and return, and constraints, and we will see those constraints in just a moment. So what about the update? Well, it has to be updated at least annually. Okay, now don't fall into the trap of thinking, look, I have this client that I got last year. I went in, I met with them for 3 hours. I gathered their data. I looked, they gave me copies of their tax returns. I looked at their old portfolio, how they've managed it. I spent 3 days digging through this. I created the investment policy statement. Everything's been going great. And then on the anniversary of starting up this account, I call them and I say, hey, Jim, okay, how are things going? Great. Do I need to make any changes? Then you feel like things are about the same? Yeah, well, I'm going to keep on with what we've been doing then. Great. Right. And then you hang up. That is not sufficient. Okay, the update has to be an effective update. So if you see a player in a question that is just having their assistant call or do something else, well, that is not sufficient for the update. There has to be an effective update. There has to be an attempt to probe the client for new information, changes, those types of things, so that we can really know what their circumstances are. Of course, we have to make an explicit decision about whether we're going to use leverage or derivatives in the portfolio. And then if we're managing a fund to some particular index or some particular bogey portfolio, then we have to invest according to the mandate, as we've already said. Okay, what about the IPS? Okay, well, as I've said a couple of times now, the IPS includes 2 things. It has to have some return objectives, and it has to say something about risk tolerance. Of course, if you have a client that has high tolerance for risk and high return objectives, that's fine. If you have a client that has very low risk tolerance but also has low expectations for return, that's fine also. Okay, and if you have a client that has high risk tolerance, okay, but low return objectives, well, that's probably not too big a problem. Of course, the problem is that nobody wants any risk and everybody wants to earn 25%, right? So anyway, we have to align these 2 things and make sure that we have adequate disclosure, and there may need to be some education associated with that, although most of those types of things we're going to put off to either levels 2 or 3. Now, I said there's 2 things we're interested in out of an investment policy statement. One is objectives, that's what you see on this slide, and the other is constraints. So constraints, what are the constraints placed on this portfolio? Now, there's what we're going to see later on in the portfolio stuff. We're going to see a better listing of the constraints. I realize this is the ethics material. This is where it should show up, but we're going to see a better listing of it. But all of them are included here. There's basically 5 constraints, but they're going to be liquidity needs. So if you're investing for a young couple that has lots of excess cash flow and they're planning for retirement, okay, well, they don't need income from their portfolio currently. They're not expecting any. Their liquidity needs will be low. If you're talking about, again, using personal finance as the example, but if you're investing for a retired couple, they're actually living off their nest egg, well, their liquidity constraints or liquidity needs will be a lot higher. Okay, so what about, expected cash flows, investable funds? That's all going to impact liquidity needs also. Time horizon, so how long do they have to invest? Okay, the tax considerations, so what is their tax constraint? Legal regulatory constraints. Now, for individuals, these are very low, but if you're talking about a life insurance company, then this is very high, right? So they have a very limited array of things they can invest in, or not very limited, but severely constrained array relative to an individual. And then finally at the bottom, unique needs. And unique needs are, by definition, anything that should be considered that is not one of the other 4 things, all right? So that would be, for, again, looking at personal finance, maybe it would be a special needs child. So a child that's going to have to be cared for after the passing of a couple. Well, then that is going to be a unique need that would be in there that would extend the time horizon, the portfolio, and that sort of stuff. So anyway, so that would be the constraints. Again, I wouldn't use this list. When we get to it later in the seminar, not today, I will point out very definitely a good compilation of the list of constraints. Okay? All right, so those are all recommended procedures, okay, and that is 3C. That's a big one. Now we can move on to 3D. Now 3D actually has a caveat associated with it that you need to make sure that you understand. So looking at this, okay, when communicating investment performance information, that means we're talking to a client and telling them how they've performed, or the best way to conceive of this is to think of yourself as presenting to a prospective client. So you've got you've made the finals, you're actually presenting to the pension board, they're thinking about throwing, $6 billion your way, okay, you're communicating your investment performance information. Well, you have the obligation under the code and standards to make a reasonable effort to ensure that the information you give them is fair, is accurate, and is complete. So those are the 3 words: fair, accurate, and complete. Okay, when you're making investment performance or investment performance presentations. Okay. Now, in a little while, we're going to talk about this thing called GIPS, G-I-P-S. Okay, Global Investment Performance Standards. Okay, that is basically a set of guidelines for making investment performance presentations. How do you gather the data? How do you calculate the returns? How do you present those returns? How much data to use to present them? All those types of things. So we have the GIPS thing going on there. Now, what is the relationship between GIPS and what we see here in Standard 3D? Well, here's the thing to remember. You are obligated, okay, as a CFA candidate or member of CFAI, you are obligated when you're making investment performance presentations to give information that is fair, accurate, and complete. All right, now, are you obligated to comply with GIPS? The answer is no. GIPS is a tool that you can use to help you do these 3 things, okay, but there may be other ways that you can be fair, accurate, and complete. So GIPS is something else. We're going to talk about it. It's part of the Level 1 curriculum, so we'll spend 20 or 30 minutes talking about it. That'll be the last thing we do in the ethics material. Okay? And that might be a way to ensure that your information or help you become fair, accurate, and complete. But if you choose not to use GIPS, you still have the obligation to be fair, accurate, and complete. So you can make brief presentations. Now, which is something common in our industry. You're going to get 6 minutes of airtime And you can't spend, if in 6 minutes of airtime, you can't spend 15 minutes giving the caveats and the backups and all this sort of stuff to what you're doing. But if you're going to make a brief presentation, you have to note its limited nature, and you have to make available more detailed information if the investors would request it. Okay? So this is something else that has been re-emphasized again in this 2010 manual that's come out, a 2010 edition of the Code and Standards, and it addresses a problem that existed before. You know, what do you do if you only have 6 minutes? Well, you can't spend 6 minutes talking about the exceptions to your presentation, right? So you got to, somewhere along the line, we got to be able to make a living. So you can make a brief presentation, note its limited nature, okay, and then make other more detailed information available. Okay, so what about guidance here? Okay, well, we can't misstate performance, obviously, and we can't mislead clients. Remember, if we can go into a presentation and everything we say is true, okay, but it's not complete, then we're still trying to mislead clients. So if we go in and say, look, we had a client that had a portfolio with constraints very similar to yours, and over the last 5 years, they've averaged 14%. Okay, well, that could be a factual statement. But if you had 100 other clients with exactly the same constraints, and if you look over all 101 portfolios, the average return was minus 14%, well, then you have still misled that client, right? You've been cherry picking the data, or cherry picking, that's a colloquialism. So cherry picking, you've been choosing the data that makes you look best. Okay, so you can't misrepresent past performance. Okay, remember, it has to be fair and it has to be complete. And complete here is going to be based on the information that a reasonable investor would need to make their decisions. So you can't state or imply, of course, the ability to achieve returns similar to those achieved in the past. That is, of course, a no-no under many state guidelines also. What about recommended procedures here? And so for recommended procedures, we want to consider audience sophistication. So when we read through GIPS and some other of the, when you're reading actually through the manual, they'll talk about disclosing the basic characteristics of the security. But if you're presenting to a pension investment committee and they're considering some sort of large cap equity portfolio investment, spending 20 minutes talking about what an equity security is probably is a waste of time, right? So we do have this nod to consider sophistication, although we would have to make basic characteristics available on request. So we want to use the performance of weighted composites, okay, of similar portfolios. So a weighted composite would mean we're looking at an investor that wants a large cap equity portfolio. We would have to look at all of our other large cap equity portfolios and present data based on that. Okay, again, these are our recommendations. Okay, and now this is something that people sometimes mess up on, and that is that we would have to include any terminated accounts in our presentation. So if we're going to present 10 years of historical data, well, 3 years ago we had a client leave us. Can we pull their returns out of our composites? Well, no, we still have years where we were managing their money in our 10-year history. Well, as long as we're presenting a history that would overlap with the time that they were clients, their information has to be included. Why is that? Well, of course, who leaves? No one has ever called their money manager and said, okay, I'm taking my money and I'm going somewhere else because you're just making me way too much money with way too little volatility, right? You leave because you think you can have better returns and lower risk somewhere else. So if you don't include those terminated accounts, then you are increasing the reported return and decreasing the reported risk associated with them. So you have to include terminated accounts, okay, and you have to, of course, make all the relevant disclosures and, of course, maintain records to support your presentation. Okay, so that is standard 3D. Okay, let's move on and talk about standard 3E, which is the preservation of confidentiality, and I'm proud to report the last part of this relatively long standard 3 duty to clients. Okay, so here we're talking about preservation of confidentiality. We've already referred to that a couple of times as we've gone through the material, but remember, we're going to have to keep current and prospective clients' data, okay, confidential. So in the financial industry, of course, we have access to lots of people's confidential information. Okay, well, it is confidential. We have to maintain that confidentiality. Now, there are some caveats where that may not be possible. Okay, if there's illegal activities that are suspected, okay, well, that may be a reason to step outside the bounds of this confidentiality. In some countries, it would be required, okay, by law that you would report that. Okay, so if the disclosure for any reason is required by law, then you have to disclose, okay? Or, of course, if the client or prospect allows you to disclose, they say, you know, you're having lunch with one of your clients and the fundraiser from some charity, and he looks at you and said, would you mind sending them a statement of my account? Or, you know, well, I don't know why they would do that. But nonetheless, if they did, the client says, sure, you can send them that information, then, of course, you can send them that information. The client has authorized you to extend that confidentiality. Okay, so what about some guidance here? Hey, in some cases, it may be required by law to report activity. So this could be some sort of money laundering activity in some countries would be required to be reported. Okay, the standard extends, of course, to former clients. So it's, you know, we said clients and prospective clients previously. Okay, well, just because somebody leaves you, you know, and goes to some other shop, you still have all their historical data about how much they saved and all those types of things. Well, you can't just post that on the internet as soon as they're no longer your client. Okay, now there is an important exception here, and this is sort of a technical element, but technical elements show up on the exam. So and I don't know that this happened, okay, but here's the story that emerges in my head. Okay, there was somebody someone had claimed that a CFA charter holder had done some sort of malfeasant, unethical behavior. So CFAI was conducting a professional conduct inquiry and went to them and said, look, we're investigating you and we need to see the records for your trading activity on this account. And they came back to him and said, whoa, under the standard of ethics, I can't give you that information, right? You're not the client. The client hasn't authorized me to do it, so I can't give it to you. Okay, well, this exception says that you can provide confidential information to CFI for the investigation under a professional conduct program. Now, I don't think this means you have to. They can't just call and ask for anyone's information, but you can't refuse to give it to them based on the code of ethics. Okay, so if they are conducting an investigation, okay, you may have other reasons, or the law may say you can't. Okay, but the code of ethics does not permit you from extending that confidence to CFAI. So there's something that's been in just the last couple of iterations of the code and standards. All right, so what about some recommended procedures here? Of course, avoid discussing information that you receive from clients with anyone other than colleagues that are working on the same project. It's on a need-to-know basis. I know because I'm working on the project, you're going to help me with a derivatives overlay, so I'm going to extend some information to you, but we shouldn't just sit around the lunch table and talk about that, all right? So remember that the firm's electronic data, we have to follow, the firm's electronic data storage procedures, and if we don't have those procedures in place, which I can't hardly imagine an investment firm in a developed country anyway being without them, but nonetheless, if they weren't, then you should recommend adoption of some procedures for how we control electronically received data. And that is Standard 3. Okay? The good news there is that, of course, we've got Standard 3 behind us. The bad news is that we still have Standards 4, 5, 6, and 7 in front of us. Although I think there's 3 down, 4 to go, but I think we're more than halfway through the code and standards here. So take heart, the last ones are a little shorter. Not real short, we still have a ways to go, but nonetheless, we're more than halfway if you're sort of, doing this. So worrying about neck injuries there. All right, Standard 4, duty to employers. Hey, I have a game you can play with yourself that will help you on the exam with respect to Standard 4. Okay, so I don't know anything about how the standards writing committee was formed or anything like that. But when I read through it, okay, in my mind's eye, I see that we have a committee of people that are putting these standards together, and on that committee, they had one too many employers. Okay, so in my estimation, this is and it's not a big deal. It's not egregious or anything like that. But in my mind, this is a document that goes out of its way to protect employers. So on the exam, if you're reading a question and we're dealing with duty to employers, is that a breach of your duty of loyalty to your employer, or is it not? Well, it probably is, because they create a fairly high standard here with respect to what is owed to the employers. Okay, so our duty of loyalty to employers is going to be something that is important. Okay, so anyway, moving on into the standards, first talking about loyalty. So what does that mean? Well, on matters related to employment, we have to act for the benefit of our employer and not do anything to derive the employer of the advantage of our skills or abilities, or divulge confidential information or otherwise cause harm to our employer. Okay, so anyway, we've got to make sure that we're acting for their benefit, and in fact, it's not just that we're not harming them. We have to make sure that in a proactive sense, we are giving them the full advantage of our skills. So if you're, planning on leaving, and we're going to work with that in a little while, but you're saying, well, I'm just going to kind of sit around and draw my paycheck for the last 90 days. Well, that's not going to work, because you're not giving your employer the full advantage of your skills and abilities. Okay, what about some guidance here? Well, of course, we're going to place clients' interests first. Never an exception to that. It does say here we have to consider that always first, but we also have to consider as secondary to or tertiary to those decisions to put clients' interests first, we have to consider the effects on firm integrity and the sustainability. Okay? So we are worried about the integrity and reputation of the firm and the sustainability of our actions within the firm. So this is sort of a nod to this. It doesn't overcome this part. Now, in the real world, we might be able to talk about compromise and those types of things. On the exam, it's always going to be the case. Place the client's interests first. Okay, so, oops, I left out the first part, so that's going to be something important. Members are encouraged to give employer a copy of the code and standards, and we can't have any incentives or compensation structure that would encourage unethical behavior. So to the extent that that exists, we ought to be trying to get rid of that in our firms, especially if we are in a position of authority. Okay, some more guidance here. So what about independent practice? And then we'll talk about leaving an employer, then we'll talk about whistleblowing, and that'll take us through the standard 3A. So independent practice, that means what? I'm working for an employer, but I'm also moonlighting. So at night, I'm going to be doing something that is related to my professional skills for some other, somebody else, and it's going to be outside the auspices of my employer. So if you're planning on engaging in independent practice, you have to notify your employer of the services provided, how long they're going to last, and the compensation. And you can't proceed without consent from your employer. Okay, so you have to notify them, give them all the relevant facts, okay, and you've got to make sure that you have their consent before you continue. All right, so that's the independent practice stuff. What about leaving an employer? Well, so, there's a difference between leaving and being gone, right? So if you have house guests, they're leaving tomorrow, well, that's not the same thing as getting to tomorrow and then being gone. Okay, so if you're leaving an employer, well, what are your responsibilities? Well, while you are leaving, you are still an employee, right? So you have to act in the best interest of the employer until your separation is effective. Remember that the employer's records are the employer's records. It doesn't matter what medium it is. If it's on your cell phone, your PDA, your home computer, all that sort of stuff, if it's the property of the firm, okay, then you are obligated to leave it with the firm. Now, once you have separated from service, okay, after you're gone, well, you still know the people you used to work with. So again, think in the case of a portfolio manager. So if we're thinking of portfolio managers here, well, they were working with lots of different people. Well, they still know those people after they leave. Well, after you've separated from your employer, can you go back and solicit those client accounts? Well, yes, you can. Once you're gone, then your debt of loyalty to that employer is over, and you're welcome to go back and solicit those clients. But you can't take with you, client lists and those types of things so that you can start your, hang out your own shingle. Okay, so, and of course, there's no use on the prohibition of the skills or experience that you gained when you were at the employer. So maybe you're in the great position that your employer is paying for this video series. And so if that's the case, then they have made a financial expenditure. You are enduring having to listen to me for hours on end, and hopefully you're going to be a more skilled financial whatever it is we call ourselves, financial analyst at the end of when you get your CFA charter. Well, the employer paid for a lot of that. Does that mean you have to do a core dump and not use that anymore? Well, of course not. That's the great thing about being in the knowledge industry. To the extent that you develop yourself, okay, that is you, and you can always take it with you. All right. Finally, what about whistleblowing here under guidance? And that'll take us through standard 4A. So here, what if you see something going on that is not kosher, or is not within the code of ethics? Okay, can you blow the whistle on your employer? Well, this is permitted only, okay, if it is done to protect a client, all right, or protect clients. So, protect clients or the integrity of the capital market. So if there's not one particular client, but capital market integrity is at stake, well, then you can blow the whistle. The thing to remember is you can't do it so that you can write a book about it. Okay, so it's not permitted for the reasons of personal gain. Okay, you have to be doing it to protect clients or to protect the capital markets. All right, that is standard 4A. Let's move on to standard 4B. Okay, so in this case, we're going to talk about additional compensation arrangements. Okay, so these are, again, this is compensation outside of the mainline compensation that you receive from your employer. What does this say? Don't accept gifts, benefits, compensation, or consideration that competes with or creates a conflict of interest with the employer's interest unless written consent is obtained from all parties. Okay, that would be your employer and the person that is giving you this additional compensation. So we've got, you can't accept any of that until you get it in writing from your employer, and you get it in writing from the person or the entity that is giving you the additional compensation. That seems, that's an example of what I mean by employer-oriented. It seems like once the employer said, sure, you can take compensation in order to do this, maybe it's going to be you get a free membership at a club for serving on the board or something. You also have to get a letter from whoever is on the board. So anyway, maybe that's reasonable. I'm not saying it's not. I just, in my opinion, it's a great way to analyze duty to employers by thinking, oh, there was one too many employers on the board or on the committee that put this together. Anyway, so what about guidance here? Compensation and benefits covers direct compensation by the client and other benefits received from any third party. So we're not just talking about cash. So if this is, use of the condo, use of the yacht, membership at the club, whatever it happens to be, all that is some type of consideration. Okay, when we talk about consent from all parties, and this is actually true across the ethics material, email communication is always going to be acceptable. But of course, make sure you hang on to your emails to protect yourself. What about recommended procedures here? Hey, we want a written report to employer with the details of the proposed compensation in addition to normal compensation and benefits. Okay, we want the details of the incentives verified by the offering party, and then we want to include the nature of the compensation, amount, all that sort of stuff. So basically, we just need lots and lots of disclosure, and we actually need cross-disclosure. We need it from the third party to the employer, and we've got to have some sort of meeting of the minds associated with that. So anyway, that's what's recommended under 4B. Okay, so what about 4C, responsibility of supervisors? Now this is another one, and this one is a little bit difficult in my estimation, and it may actually run counter to my general intuition about one too many employers. Okay, but when we talk about supervisors, we're going to have a couple of words that are going to be really important. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're essentially going to set a very high standard for what supervisors should be doing. So in other words, if you observe a violation in a question on the exam, so someone's done something wrong, they're lying, cheating, stealing, okay? Well, they are supervised by somebody, so we have a supervisor over them, right? Well, it's very frequently the case that we're going to have some sort of ethical breach on a fundamental level, and we're going to have a failure of the responsibility of the supervisors if the supervisors didn't make a reasonable effort. Okay, and here, this idea of reasonable effort, again, is a word you have to worry about. Well, I contend that there needs to be a very high standard to what is a reasonable effort. In other words, the supervisor has to be very diligent to not be culpable in the violation of their underling. All right? So make reasonable effort to detect and prevent violations of applicable laws, rules, regulations, all the code and standards by anyone subject to your supervisory authority, right? Supervision or authority. So this is the role of supervisors, okay? And oops, I need to go back here. Okay, so now we talked about reasonable effort. Now I told you there's two important words here. Okay? Now what are the important words in this statement? And reasonable, we talked about that one. That's not the one I was talking about. Okay, the ones I'm talking about are reasonable effort to detect violations and prevent violations. So if they're doing lots of stuff to prevent violations, but they're not doing much to detect them if they occur anyway, or if we have great back-end procedures to detect them, but we're not doing much to prevent them on the front end, then we are not living up to what would be a reasonable effort standard here. All right? So supervisors must take efforts to prevent employees from violating the rules. They must also make reasonable efforts to detect. So we have the prevent and the detect requirements here. And they should also enforce non-investment rules. So when we think of this, we think about, well, you know, the soft dollar standards and the prudent man versus prudent investor rule and, you know, all of the diversification and those types of things. But there's also things like mandatory vacations. Okay, you got to get out of the building 2 weeks a year. And there's, of course, that's also, you know, a vital systems control. You know, that's how you keep a scam going, is you're always there to stay one step ahead of it. If you're out of the building for 2 weeks, that's when they come unraveled. But things that don't have to do directly with the economics of what it is you're doing, okay, well, we have to enforce those also. Okay, so what about recommended procedures? And so adequate compliance procedures should include the following. They have to be clear and understandable. Okay, well, that makes sense. We have to designate a compliance officer. They have to have checks and balances. And we have to have procedures for reporting violations. Those are all recommended. Okay, but there's some other recommendations here. All right. So when we think of this, we say, well, what should the supervisor or compliance officer be doing? Well, they have to distribute procedures and update those periodically. So distribute and update. Okay, down here, the third bullet point, review employee action. Well, that's a big one. Okay, and then promptly initiate procedures if a violation has occurred. All those represent a high standard. What bothers me here, and what I've seen previously, is this idea of continually educate staff. So the notion that you know, there's a player in the problem there. You have the supervisor, and we have some new MBA freshly minted coming out of school, and you know, well, you're going to be working in my department. Here's our compliance manual. I want you to read that, and if you have any questions, you can either come back to me or you can go talk to the compliance department. But we really want you to read that because we place a high value on ethics. Okay, that's not continually educating staff. Continually educating staff means you're sending updates out, you're having meetings about it, you know, you are, I don't know what else it would mean, but it does not mean that once a year at a faculty retreat, or excuse me, at an employee retreat, you can tell I'm in academia, faculty retreat, anyway, at an employee retreat, you say, okay, does anyone have any question about ethics? Okay, well, that's not continual education. We have a much higher standard than that, is the point. Okay, so what about once a violation has occurred? Okay, well then we have to respond promptly. So if they wait 10 days to do something about it, they didn't respond properly. They have to have a thorough investigation. And down here, important words, okay, while the investigation is going on, and you know, we're responding properly, but it sometimes takes a while to get all the facts together, we have to place appropriate limitations on the suspected wrongdoer because they're not, we have to make sure that they can't initiate the same type of ethical breach that we are suspecting that they may have committed in the past. So we have to have some type of limitation on them while we're moving forward with the investigation. And if we just let them keep going and doing what they're doing, the problem with that, of course, is that they can, you know, undertake more unethical behavior and damage more clients during the interim period. And that is standard 4C.